Okay, now we should see people start to join, I believe. I'm not seeing attendees yet.
Oh no. You mean social change isn't a hot topic?
Really?
Well, I'm just wondering if the join link is active yet.
I don't know how she doesn't lose her mind. God,
Okay.
they can't hear me, right?
Are we, Huzaifa, is that how I say your name, number one? And then number two, is the link active? Should I be seeing attendees popping in?
Yeah, we should be seeing the attendees popping in right now. Because the link is active, let me confirm with my team in 1 minute. Just
Okay, thank you. I just know that in the last session, people were talking about coming to this session. So I know that there should be attendees. And, the fact that there aren't makes me strongly believe something could be up with the link.
Kat, I made some empty space for
Okay,
capture on the Miro board.
okay, thank you.
Mel title as well.
Can you move yourself any closer?
Not really. The camera angle is fixed.
Hmm.
I just also pinged Jane.
There's Sue multitasking.
I was actually looking at the Slack to see what was going on in the Slack channel.
Okay, yes. I guess we'll hold for a second because people are getting an error when they try to enter this room.
There we go.
I don't want to start without them just because I know I've already talked to, so we are recording. We'll obviously cut this out, but I don't want to start without the live audience because several people have already mentioned that they wanted to attend this one live.
Mel, I gift you 3 of my minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There we go. Starting to see some attendees now and some familiar names actually. So as folks start to enter, I'll point out that we have Q&A. You should be able to enter in your Q&A. And you can also use the Zoom chat if you so desire, but some people have been having issues switching between hosts and panelists and everyone. And if you are not sending it to everyone, then everyone won't see your message. I am also currently in the chat for the Where Room So the society track is the square window or whatever, and I will be monitoring that chat throughout this talk in case you have any questions or anything like that that you'd like to pop in there. Okay, I think that's all the announcements. So like I said, this is the society track. I'm the chair for this track, Kat Swattel, and this session is mapping for social change. I'm very excited for this one. Yes, and our first panelist is Mel Conway, and folks may know him from ye old drinking game. How many times will we mention Conway's Law at our conference? Yes, but what you may not know is that Mel Conway is a lot of other things, including a really inspiring systems thinker and an educator, and someone who's really passionate about inspiring social change and giving us tools to reflect on change. So I guess with that, I will hand it off to you, sir.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Now, can you see my first slide, an exercise in situational awareness?
Yep.
Okay, here we go. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, or night, wherever in the world you are. That's me at the bottom on Twitter, by the way. Okay, I'm going to tell us a little story about how this got started, and then I'll get into the real story. 2 years ago, I discontinued a quarter century of research on programming accessibility and returned to my first love from a half century before, applying system thinking to human organization. I started tweeting about cults, mass disinformation, and propagation of lies in politics. I discovered that there is a common structural element to all of these. I have come to call it clumping in connected networks. That's a lot of fancy for unfairness. So today I'm going to focus on the structure of unfairness. It turns out that we're stuck with unfairness when we scale up to the kinds of connectedness that the internet, smartphones, and social media have given us. The unfairness comes out of the structure. The top 3 bullets there about dealing with the structure of unfairness listed here all show up in politics. I'm not going to discuss them in this talk. I'm going to discuss the underlying structure. Now, a personal word about that 4th bullet, which I'm also not going to discuss in this talk. My work of the last 2 years is based on these 2 articles of faith. First, it is possible to understand what underlies many of the perverse social phenomena that mystify us today, such as how groups of people in the tens of millions can believe public stories totally unsupported by evidence. We can do this by looking inside the dynamics of the forces that bind these groups of people together in their common belief. In language that I, as a mathematician, can turn into action, there is a way to understand perverse social behavior in terms of clumping in networks. Second, understanding at this level of detail will lead to new and creative strategies for weakening those binding forces. But this understanding isn't happening in the public discourse, and the strategies aren't appearing. Why? The answer follows directly from the half-century-old Conway's Law. And I'm reading a paraphrase at the left. The solutions you can find to the problems you have depend on who is talking to whom. And the solutions we need right now require a synthesis of understandings that lie in multiple disciplines that don't talk to each other, in particular, individual psychology, group psychology, politics, and the mathematics of systems. Now, over 60 years ago, C.P. Snow delivered a Cambridge lecture that became the book, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. To quote Wikipedia, its thesis was that science and the humanities, which represented the intellectual life of the whole Western society, had become split into two cultures, and that this division was a major handicap to both in solving the world's problems. That handicap, in my view, is number one in our social problem to-do list. We've made almost no progress addressing that handicap because of our impermeable institutional walls. I'm dedicating this talk to breaking down a few of those walls. Now to the business at hand. I'll show you a sequence of 4 examples that I hope will lead us to a deeper understanding of how social groups work. Here are a couple of unsettling conclusions I've come to. First, if you believe that all we have to do is make society work better is to make markets work better, think again. And I'm going to say this twice. Adam Smith's invisible hand doesn't scale up beneficially, it scales up perversely. Adam Smith's invisible hand scales up perversely. We have an undiscovered structural problem. In my view, that's the real Facebook problem. It's the structure that we're now stuck with because of the scale of connectedness that we're dealing with. Second, there is a causal thread from one of our most powerful social inventions, the public corporation, to our current environmental crises. We can disagree about how determinative that threat is, but we cannot dismiss it. That will be the topic of my last slide. Okay, in this example, I'm going to construct a thought experiment to introduce a basic concept underneath unfairness, the long tail. Here we have 4 generations of inheritance from the original. The generations are numbered at the bottom. Generation 0, ancestors starting with an asset of 100 units. In each generation, each recipient, there are 2 recipients in each generation, passes the exact total of the inheritance onto 2 successors, slightly unequally, either 70-30 or 60-40 in alternating generations. In the 4th generation, we have 16 beneficiaries, each with assets as shown in the red box. That's the data set I'll use in the next slide. Here is a plot of those 16 inheritances. This bar chart is a ranked order distribution. It's not your normal XY plot. Instead, it's a presentation of the, in this case, 16 players in a game ranked in order of winnings, with the biggest winnings shown by the height of the bar first. So the value on the horizontal axis is the order number, an integer starting with 1 and going up to the size of the population, whatever it is. That's the common element of a ranked order distribution. Now, if things were fair, each recipient would get the average, that dotted red line, 100 divided by 16 or 6 1/4. What's important to see is that 6 of the 16 are above the average on the left, and 10 of the 16 are below the average on the right. The majority of the population tails off to the right below average. That's the long tail. It turns out that this relationship shows up all over the place in nature. Ziff was a linguist studying word frequencies in natural languages. The law is named after him. The bars show a general relationship. Frequency is roughly proportional to the fraction 1 divided by the order number. In general, it's really 1 divided by the order number to some low numbered power, so it's called the power law. In this graph, there are two powers shown, 1 and 2. Each bar color totals to 100. The blue bars show 1 over n, which applies to word frequency. The red bars 1 over n squared, which is roughly Pareto's 80-20 rule. You get 80% of your results from 20% of your inputs. The first two of those red bars add up to 81 out of the 100 total. Okay, now here is real data on wealth inequality in the United States. Bottom line, all wealth, this is real by the way, as of 2019, all wealth is held by the top half of the population. The bottom half has nothing. That is, people who live from paycheck to paycheck or worse. In that top half, you even see the long tail. 30% of the top half is held by the top 1%. That's the dark red band at the top. The next 40% is held by the remainder of the top 10%. That totals 70%. The remaining 30% is held by the remaining 40% of the top half of the population. Now watch this. I made a few innocent interpolations with those numbers and came up with this ranked order distribution. 90% of the population has assets below the average on the right. The last 50% has essentially zero. That's the wealth distribution as of 2 years ago in the United States. Okay, now let's deal with markets. This second example sets us up for the remaining 3 examples. They are about markets in which the effects of the long tail will show up. In this experiment, we have, say, 10 sellers selling essentially interchangeable products to, say, 100 buyers. Initially, the buyers don't communicate with each other, but I'll quickly change that. Here is the case in which the buyers don't communicate. There are the buyers at the top. I've shown only a small sample of the possible buyers, the Bs, and transactions, the lines from B to S. Every transaction opportunity is independent, so a useful model is tossing dice. At the bottom is the expected rank order distribution of the popularity of the sellers. They're all equally likely. Now let's introduce a network that permits any buyer to send a message to any other buyer, shown in red there. We've got lots of those on the internet. Many use 5-star rating systems with comments. We make 2 assumptions in addition. Some buyers express preferences. Some other buyers are influenced by those expressions. Something interesting happens. These preferences ricochet through the network, influencing other preferences. When it all settles down, what do we have? Zipf's law strikes again. A Zipf law ranked order distribution. And by the way, down at the bottom, Clay Shirky, Power Logs, Web Logs, and Inequality. That's where I learned about this. You can Google that. Now it gets interesting. These companies have to be profitable, and there are fixed costs. In large corporate, capital-intensive markets, think oil, steel, autos, web hosting, there's a profitability threshold, the red line at the bottom. Now, dozens of years ago, I read a competition study from the Boston Consulting Group on market concentration. There was a very clear takeaway for me. You might survive, but you do not want to be number 3. Being number 3 is hard. Look around at the large emerging tech-based markets today and see the dynamic in operation. Businesses seem to struggle to avoid being number 3. So what happens? The losers in the long tail start disappearing. Now, Can you see my pointer? That's mega global enterprises there, swallowing up a loser. Now, how does mega global enterprises do it? With cheap stock. By cheap, I mean cheap to existing shareholders, but valuable to the seller. In other words, high priced stock. MGE must maintain its leadership so it doesn't slide into the long tail. It does this by growing. The cheapest way to grow is through acquisition. MGE maintains its leadership by growing and using its growth to keep its stock price up so it can grow through acquisition. Do you see the circularity there? I call that circularity the grow or die imperative. It's a dynamic that comes out of the coupling of two internally interconnected markets. That coupling has grown to global scale and led to a problem of sustainability for all of us. Here are the two markets. MGE has proxies in two coupled markets, the industrial market on the left, in which it sells its products, and the equities market in which it sells its stock. There is a positive feedback loop between these two proxies. MGE drives its growth in the industrial market through acquisition and delivers, there it is, and delivers the news of that growth to the equities market. That growth news raises the price of MGE's stock, which MGE then uses to conduct its acquisitions. MGE must continue this product in order to stay out of the long tail. Now, when you scale this up to global magnitudes, it turns out that we all have been delivered a sustainability problem. In this last slide, I'll leave you with a suggestion that the dynamic I've been describing has something to do with the sustainability problems we've been noticing lately. I'll leave it to you to make these connections. Now, the link at the bottom of the slide lists the first 5 bullets. And to those, I've added 2 more of my own. So my parting question for you is there a connection? And if so, what is that connection from the grow or die imperative to these global implications? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. That was wonderful and very thought-provoking. Yes, so the session format for this triad is that we're going to do all 3 talks and then have an extended discussion and Q&A time. So with that, we'll go into the next talk, which is going to be Sue, I believe, right? Okay, cool. And Sue is a freelance research artist. I love the phrase research artist, but she didn't start out that way. So she has a technology background and, you know, a variety of really interesting journeys, I think, along your path, right, Sue? And now you're really interested and kind of dedicated to social change. And I'm also really interested in how you are looking at social change at a variety of levels, right? Like municipal and state and kind of different levels. So I'm really interested in that. And I'm very excited that you're joining us today. And I am excited to hear your perspective on mapping for social change. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Cool. Thank you. I'm gonna share my presentation now. Hopefully y'all can see that. And this is it. So I'll give you the bird's eye view first here. So hang on one sec. Still have too many windows open. Here we go. Okay. Since learning of Warley mapping, which was probably a couple of years ago, I've been trying to figure out how to translate it to peace and social justice work. It didn't feel very obvious to me. So I made an animation because that's often what I do when I'm trying to make sense of things. I'm not going to play it now, but there's a link on the board and we'll share this board with you all. Basically trying to translate the language of strategy, which is mostly warfare and competition based, into peace and social justice. So I've been using as a case study or a case to play with mapping is Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And I've chosen that organization because I'm on the board and I have a little bit of a window into what our mission is and how we're trying to achieve it. Interfaith Action for Human Rights is a nonprofit. We work in Washington, D.C. area, so Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. And the mission of the organization is to end the use of solitary confinement in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia prisons. Since DC doesn't have their own prisons, they use federal prisons. We do have a little bit of a wider swath there. So about a year ago, I came across the work of Alnor Ibrahim and dug into his book, Measuring Social Change, Performance and Accountability in a Complex World, because it really, a talk he gave that I found, an online keynote that was shared with me, really bridged this gap for me. He was working in this space of social change and has been. He's a professor at Tufts, and he was at the intersection of strategy and social change, which I've just found this book just an amazing wealth of information. So he lays out what he calls a social performance model. And this isn't really how he lays out the model in his book. I've sort of taken the model, which is these 4 core elements here in the middle, and just expanded it out to include some of the descriptions that he includes and elaborates on in the book. But the core of the model is complexity informed, which I think a lot of people will resonate with. And what really struck me, though, is this frame of accountability that he has there. It's multiple accountabilities. We're often accountable to our funders and our donors and our grantors, as well as the people that we serve. And he describes accountability as a relationship of power and asks the question, how can we shift away from accountabilities of compliance to accountabilities of strategy, which I found just a really generative idea as I started mapping the Interfaith Action mission. So in terms of the complexity informed stuff, he has, this, in order to have a social performance model, you need a social change model, an idea about the cause and effect of how you're going to go about making this change. And so the theory of change and the logic model, also known as results chain in his language, are contingent on how predictable is the cause and effect going forward for your mission, and how much control do you have over that mission. So I'm going to jump over here to a blow up of this. So these are this is the contingency framework. So let's say your mission was to provide meals to homeless people in a large city. That has a low uncertainty. We know how to do that. People have been doing that for decades. Cranking out meals is not difficult. But there's a low control in that scenario over the larger problem of homelessness. So that, he would say, is low control, low uncertainty. So you would have a niche strategy. So feeding homeless people in DC is the mission of an organization called Miriam's Kitchen in Washington, DC. I should say was the mission, their initial mission. And they have done and still do that. They've done it for decades. But they started to realize that there were so many other needs of the people who came to them for meals. And they started doing case management and offering other services. And they eventually adopted a new strategy, an ecosystem strategy, where there was more of, well, the new mission was to end chronic homelessness in Washington, D.C. So it was high uncertainty. How do you do that? And higher control over the problem, higher than just providing meals. Ibrahim frames it as high control. I would just say higher, because I think it's still kind of questionable how much control you do have in that scenario. So of the cases in Ibrahim's book, he gives a case study for each of these 4 quadrants. I thought Miriam's Kitchen's challenge was the most similar to interfaith action. So I really dug into that case study. There was so much great detail provided. There was the results chain. There was an ecosystem map that was given that shows, all the players. And I took 2 passes at mapping these in Kumu. I made some Kumu maps of this original results chain, and then I tried to move it around and put it on an evolutionary axis. I'm not going to go into this unless folks are interested later. And then I did another one of the system mapping. I had much more luck with that one, the system map, ecosystem map for Miriam's Kitchen, because I could actually see the moves they made, which I'll also go into later if folks are interested. I'm going to try and stick tight to my schedule here though. And then I took the lessons from those mapping exercises and what I had learned from Ibrahim's book, and I made a mashup template, which was taking Ibrahim's social model, which I kind of stretched out. I had made this in Kumu. And then I took sort of the components of his social performance model and stretched them across the top of a Wardley map. So I could sort of see where the gaps were in our work. And then along the vertical axis, I put his results chain, which are sort of like buckets. Like we have, this is hard to see, but if anybody wants the Kumu links to this, I'm providing them. You have the inputs, activities, outputs, individual outcomes, and societal outcomes. And this was a boon for me because I wrestled with these multiple accountabilities and multiple scopes the whole time I've been trying to do these mapping exercises for societal change. So then I took this template and I took a pass at mapping Interfaith Action's mission. And I did 2 of these maps. I did one using online Wardley map, onlinewardleymapping.com, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. And I did another using my Kumu mashup. And some of the insights here, I tried to sum up insights, puzzles, and next steps in creating this talk. One insight was I was dead wrong about which contingency framework we're operating in. We are, so this is Ibrahim's contingency framework again, and the approach that kind of goes with it. And Miriam's Kitchen had sort of a standardized and streamlined approach for delivering meals. That makes total sense. And then they had to expand that, sort of include that for meal provision, but also expand that to orchestration for their ecosystem strategy. And we are much more in the low control, high uncertainty in terms of ending solitary confinement. So that is, he calls an emergent strategy. And the approach should be much more iterate and adjust, sort of wayfind your way through. And just for information, an integrated strategy is appropriate, he says, for when you have, it's basically a coordination strategy because you have multiple niches. You're just trying to coordinate a whole bunch of niche strategies, niche services. So I looked least closely at that case study in the book. So what are my other insights? I found one of my big struggles was around the original map, which I am going to show you here. Let's see. This was the results chain that I made, that I took from the book. And I'm just zooming in on it so you can see some of the language here. It's almost like a whole bunch of strategic moves that are laid out in arcs into the future. So time was really messing with my head when I tried to wordly map the now, because that was another insight. Like, don't try and project into the future until you got your map, and then look at moves. Like, map the now was one of my big insights. And so when I tried to map this, I ended up with a bunch of these sort of what I'm borrowing a term from Ben Mosier of like user journeys, but they're almost like strategy journeys. So you can see like the language is sort of like local organizations and agencies are more aligned in their approach to ending chronic homelessness. This was for the ecosystem strategy strand. So it's like saying they will come to be more aligned in their approach. They will come to have a unified front. And so I had to really abandon that. So that was one of the big insights. In terms of that user journey across the top tool that Ben does, I find that really useful. I took that approach for my online Wardley mapping version, which allowed me to map Interfaith Action's main moves, which was really helpful for me. But I just took this arc through the system in a way, and I think there could be a lot more work done with that across the top. I included sort of the institutional pipeline, since that pipeline has some dovetails with our work. But I think that pipeline could really be used as the basis for the ecosystem map if we were to do that. So that was the other thing I learned. We don't really have a system map. We haven't spent time making that map. And so you can see here, I colored this one sort of bright green, and I have this in Kumu too, which I can share so people can play around with this. We haven't really done that work yet. We don't have a formal system for identifying and building new capabilities. They do emerge through our work. We have a couple new things that have come on board. We have pro bono legal work now. Down here at the bottom, you can see we have started connecting things that we're hearing about managing the prison population, like the use of attack dogs in DC, where we hear that, and it's horrific. Talking about human rights violations. And so we've gotten sort of into this soliciting pro bono law firms to take up lawsuits in those cases. And so that's new things that are capabilities that are emerging, but it's very ad hoc, comes up through the conversations. In terms of, let's see, puzzles. How might we be more accountable? Sorry, my accountabilities here are these orange dots. So how might we be more accountable, not only to our donors, which are here, and our grantors down here, but also to the people that we primarily serve, who are incarcerated people? That's a really difficult challenge, because communication is so difficult. I'm a pen pal with someone in a federal prison, and we have so much trouble even getting letters through. They just disappear sometimes. So that's one of my puzzles. How might we map more of the ecosystem? And the possible next steps, for me, sharing these maps, this work that I've done with the board to see how our strategic priorities, which we have spent time with as a board, could be mapped and furthered using this tool. I've been a sort of closet mapper in the context of interfaith action. And so that would be one step. The other thing is that next step might be to share this work with Ibrahim himself, Alnor Ibrahim, because I think widely mapping could bring some kind of shared language to the work of system mapping, which is very ad hoc right now. You know, this type of system map for Miriam's Kitchen was the only one of the cases that had this kind of ecosystem map. And so and I found it really valuable to put that in a Wardley frame. So I think that's 15 for me. So I'm going to stop talking.
All right. Thank you so much, Sue. That was, again, very thought-provoking. And I haven't read that book before. I'll have to check it out. Okay. And with that, we'll have our final panelist before we go into the Q&A. And this is my friend, Tara McGrath. And she is amazing. And we have had a chance to collaborate before. And so I'm pumped that we're here doing Map Camp together. She's the head of product innovation for the digital capability at Novartis, but she has done, again, just a wide variety of things. She has worked in nonprofit, she's been in academia, just all over the place. So I'm very excited, again, for just a completely different perspective on this. So with that, hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Tara, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey as a stupid fish. And you've heard from Mel, you've heard from Sue, which had incredibly articulate and engaging presentations. But I'm just going to talk about something that's very, very simple in the true spirit of being a stupid fish. So let's start off with making the assumption that there's two types of people in the world. I know that there's lots of more types of people in the world, but just for the sake of this story, let's just assume there's two. So there's those who want to make things better for others, and there's those that want to make things better for themselves. What kind of words do you think of when you think of the people that want to make things better for others? It's always really good words, really positive words. So like good, selfless, kind, wonderful, caring. And the ones that want to make things better for themselves, there's a sort of negative associated with them. So we've got selfish, self-serving. Maybe a positive is probably a bit more rich, right? And if you think back to Mel's diagram of the wealth distribution, maybe that's up in the upper sections of there. The story of this fish, who happens to be me, unfortunately, is where I struggled going between one type of person to the other type of person over and over and over again. So I'll start at the beginning. So once upon a time, a fish wanted to make the world less bad. Not good, not amazing, not better, but a little bit less bad. It started off at about age 6, where the fish had a major meltdown in the middle of no man's land in Cyprus because she couldn't figure out which side was the good guys and which side is the bad guys. So would not leave the middle of no man's land until she had more information so she could make a decision and decide which side she was going to move towards. It ended up with dad picking them up and carrying her off. At age 15, they wanted to help people that they had experienced negative things in their closer community. So cancer was one of those things. So the fish created an open source cancer treatment because she wanted to help people close to them. At 17, the fish decided to create a fuel efficient stove because she wanted to help everybody in the world and reduce indoor air pollution for women. Now, this was the big one. So the Irish government, obviously from my accent, you can tell where I'm from, decided that this was the best thing ever. A 17-year-old girl, had taken this idea and was going to help save the world with her amazing idea. So they took her and a film crew to Ethiopia to test out this stove, surrounded by hundreds of women testing this stove, tears and claps. One woman whispered into her ear and said, this is great, but how are we going to cook our food, because we eat injera and that's flat, and you've just made a pot. So she very quickly learned her first lesson. Oh, and I don't know why that moved. Ask the people what they need before you make it for them. So the fish decided they needed to learn a lot more. So they started to get some studying done. Initially, they wanted to do product development and learn about industrial design, but the fish decided to study international development and food policy. That's where she gets into all the nitty-gritty of what Sue has been describing: logical frameworks, sustainable plans. She learned about microfinance, she learned about agriculture, she learned about statistics. But so much time was spent figuring out how to write grant applications, which she was pretty confused about. Second lesson, most of the job for charitable organizations around funding, which is a really difficult thing because you looked at what Sue spoke about, and there's a lot of work that has to be done on the other side once that funding comes into place. So I made an attempt at trying to map this, and there's a whole lot of money involved, or a whole lot of time involved in custom doing this. So you think about the users, we've got people that are experiencing poverty, we've got people that are, there's inequality, there's a whole lot of issues, there's human rights violations, but you also have to interact with governments, individuals, corporates, philanthropists, community groups. And I focused on just the corporate companies. And you can look at this a little bit more later if you like, but this was, almost everything was in custom. So a huge amount of time, a huge amount of effort. And then after all of that, the funding might come and it might go to another 4 of the charities that they're looking to work with. So, and the last lesson was that charitable organizations have very little time and resources to do that. And if that didn't make the fish cynical, these are the things that she was hearing. So I want you to take a minute and just read through some of the things that the fish was hearing in this context after spending lots of time looking for funding. Before we ever got to do anything with anyone in a project. So the fish gave up. And they decided to be one of the people that made things better for herself. So at age 29, the fish went to work for a corporate organization because surely they do things much better. And then around the age of 30, when she was ready to join one of the committees again, got to see how corporates interact with charitable organizations. So remember, she had spent a lot of time talking to corporate organizations for funding. And now she was in a corporate organization who was making the decisions. So we started to try and map what it was like from the corporate side. And I think this links to where Mel was talking about. So this is the mega global enterprise that swallows up other companies, but it's okay because they do CSR and they give some money to charities. So they spend an awful lot of time with governance, and you can look through this map a little bit more clearly. But if you look at the charity partners that they interact with, what they want is funding, and they probably want non-restricted funding, which helps them to pay for salaries and things like that. And then what they deliver is pretty clear. They run programs to make the world better with their expertise. And what Sue spoke about was very clearly outlined that they know what they're doing there. But all of this other work is all around here. And often they have to hire a consultancy to manage this work because the expertise isn't in the not-for-profit. So that's one of the big challenges. So there's a huge level of governance when trying to find funding, but there's different needs. There's massive investment of time and budgets on both sides before anything gets done. The language is different, but moving towards something more similar with product, but that's another talk because I think value and things are merging together a bit more. The relationship is unequal. So that's where, Sue, you mentioned about accountability and that power relationship, which is hugely unequal. And sustainability is absent because often these happen annually. So you've got to go back in and do it all over again. I use the counterproductive framework, and I feel like all of the things that we do fit into what are the worst things that would happen. So if anyone's interested in TRIZ, I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. So how are we going to get anything done if we spend so much time in these custom areas? So there's a clear need to strategically map together early to move things out of custom. And I want to leave you with this quote of why I have spent my career feeling like a stupid fish. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we'll have 45 minutes of discussion, and we do have questions from the audience. So let's see, I'll remove the spotlight on. Here we go. All right, now can everyone see our lovely panelists? I hope you can. Okay, terrific. Cool. Okay, so we do have questions here, and we covered a lot of ground. So I would assume we'll get even more questions because we talked about social change from 3 really different perspectives. So the first question, which is directed towards Mel, but I have a feeling that it's relevant to everyone. And this is from Jonathan. He says, thanks, Mel, for the talk. You are inferring that antitrust and competition authorities are not effectively regulating mergers and acquisitions to maintain competition. Is that correct? So I think the question here is really around competition and markets.
I'd rather change the subject to the current problem, which is what we call, quote, the Facebook problem, which is the use of social networking. I don't really have a comment about competition in general. I mean, antitrust has worked in the past in the more industrial model, but our current problem has to do with connectivity and the scale of connectivity and the fact that it's creating new phenomena like riots and insurrections. And we don't have a theory about that. And what I'm saying is that our classical approaches don't really address that because there are these new phenomena which arise from the scale. So I'm not quite agreeing that classical antitrust doesn't work. It may have worked for the classical organizations, but I assert that it's not working to deal with what social networking is doing within society now.
Yeah, I'll put my 2 cents in here, even though no one asked for it, but so I have been doing some research, actual research, not like, sitting looking on my cell phone at Facebook memes, but actual research about iBuyers. So these are, I don't know if they have them all over the world, but they certainly have them here in the United States. These are real estate buyers who buy homes, right? But basically without any of the traditional real estate process. So this like Zillow and OfferPad and all of these, right? And but they're using that, right? Then the network effects, it's definitely a network play to buy up real estate. And of course, there are lots of unintended consequences of that, like driving up real estate prices and making housing completely unaffordable in large metropolitan areas. But even that, so that's not a social movement, right? That's like a capitalist thing that we got going on. That's a market. Even that, I would just point out that the antitrust regulation and even other sorts of regulation that are designed to protect consumers through fostering competition, none of those are being effectively applied to iBuyers, which I think is a great example of a proper network play in capitalist market. So, Jonathan, I hope that you're sufficiently depressed along with the rest of us now, and we can, I don't know if we want to hear from Sue or Tara on that one. Do you want to do anything besides cry?
I can speak to your comment, Kat, by the way. But go ahead, Jonathan. I'll speak after.
She said, please.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I get a letter a week from an individual, quote, whose address is in the next town, offering to buy my house for cash. And I'm pretty confident that who's really talking to me is Wall Street. And so what we have is another example of two markets being coupled, which is what I showed for the mega global enterprises case. Now the private real estate market and the finance market are being coupled by this new connection. And heaven knows what that's going to lead to. It's another, perhaps another growth, grow or die imperative, like the first one did. So this is just another example of this coupling of independent things that's happening.
Yeah. Tara, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I think so. From my perspective, from my context, and thinking about like a charitable organization, we definitely have that survive piece as well. So if you think about that power and accountability thing, the owner, like who is actually making the decisions that the not-for-profit is making because of the accountability to the large corporates or to the government agencies or to whoever is paying that money, and then what is the motivation for them to do that? Is it, I'm doing bad things, so I'm going to invest in this to make it seem better? So that's, yeah, to put another level of depression into it. That's another element that I can see.
Great.
I don't know if what I have to offer counters the depression or not, but I kind of think it does in a way. I think about competition a lot because it just seems to be as presumed as what's driving a lot of our collective emergent phenomenon. And I did a series of animations with a guy named Michael Muthukrishna at the London School of Economics on cultural evolution. And I look a lot at a lot of things through the lens of evolution. And Michael really made, his research shows that competition isn't enough for evolution. There's always these aggregating. And I think, Mel, in one of the early drafts of your talk, you talked a lot about affinity groups. So that tends to be non-collaborative, right? We're not competing, we're actually clumping together to help each other and to create a community. And so I think that even though we get a little down about the competition, I don't think that's the only driving force at play here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can speak to that again.
Sure.
I've got a graphic of a line of geese following each other. There are phenomena in individual psychology that we're not accounting for. And there's one in particular that is attachment theory, which psychologists have all kinds of words about in children, but I think it hasn't been recognized that it applies to adults too. And in fact, it's really the underlying phenomenon between some of these really weird group things we're seeing happening. And that's why I brought up C.S. Snow in my second or third slide, because we got people who need to talk to each other who aren't talking to each other. The psychologists and the mathematicians and the system people need to start talking to each other. Okay, end of speech.
On that note, we did get a few questions and then some comments in the chat and everywhere. I'm trying to connect across chat, Q&A, Twitter. But we got a fair number of questions and comments about the mashups. So Sue, you did some mashups, right, of different approaches. And then Tara, you mentioned some other approaches that you use. And I personally know from working with you that you are like the queen of mashups. And so I think there's something there, right? With how do we build bridges like Sue, you were talking about, and maybe one of the ways that we do that is by making mashups of the different models that we use in different disciplines. So I would love to hear from you folks on that. And maybe we want to start with Sue, since you really featured those mashups.
So someone in the chat posed a question: what issues do I have when I make them? It's hard. It's a lot of thinking to first internalize a new model. Like Ibrahim's model took me a while. It's a really rich, dense book, but chock full of stuff. But now that I've done it, I feel like I'm just excited to do more. One of the next steps I didn't talk about was I've been working with a group. We've been developing a model of trust. And one of the things that we did in that group, we've been meeting on Miro for a little over a year. And we widely mapped an organization that realized it had a trust issue between its C-suite and the rest of the organization. And it was so interesting to see how it revealed moves. So I'd love to maybe formalize that trust model as one of the Wardley mashups, because it's been so generative to me. It's still emerging, but it's called the Hart-Pence model of trust, named after Joyce Hart-Pence, who created it. So that's one thought. Like, I'm all for it. I'm in to the mashup.
Well, I can come in. So I used to think that, going back to being a stupid fish, but I used to think that I was being super silly by always trying to mash everything together. And then somebody lately told me that that was my superpower. So now I'm flipping it over and thinking about how, because the connectivity with different things, I'm absolutely not a Wordly mapping expert, but I'll try it, give it a go. But I don't know why the presentation seems to have disappeared a little bit on our Miro board, but I have different canvases that are pushed underneath different areas. So when thinking about what I learned, the first lesson that I learned around empathy, that empathy mapping piece is really important. So if I had the tool of an empathy map at the point when I was designing my super wonderful fuel efficient stove, that would have been really useful. And then a tool that I would have brought in the results to mapping. The same with the counterproductive framework from Triz. It's something that I've adapted from an article, but it's like, what's the worst thing that you can do? And then working through those areas. And so that helps me to do prediction. So when I'm trying to map something that I haven't done yet, or I can think of, like, use that one to link in with that. And I have been spending a lot of time on Miro trying to put all the canvases that I use into one place, and how they connect to each other and which ones are complementing each other. But there's never kind of like one fixed piece. But the challenge I do feel with it is when I am talking to somebody that is super familiar like so familiar. I guess it's very similar to the quote that Mel used at the start. If someone's so familiar with one specific way of doing things, trying to communicate with them in a way that mashes things together is like, it's almost like an uncanny valley feeling. It's like, it's kind of the same, but it's kind of different. So it's making me feel uncomfortable. So I don't want to engage with it. And I found that that's a challenge.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing that, like the uncanny valley. I've talked about disfluency before, like, you know, sometimes it's really good to make the tools that people have really conspicuous to them, because a lot of times we're just swinging our hammer and not even thinking about the hammer. And other times it's just a bunch of overhead, you know, to make people think about the tools that they're using or what they're doing. So requires great care, and that's definitely a superpower, I think. So we have a really unruly participant named Simon Wardley, who I think tried to do a little mashup of its own and put multiple questions into just one question. So if I may, which I definitely may because I'm the moderator, I'm going to dissect that into a couple different questions. So the first one I definitely noticed, even though this is the social change session and not the me versus we session, there was a thread of me versus we across all of your 3 talks. But I think the thing that was there that no one said, but everyone implied, was that me is one of the actors contained in a we, right? So am I doing this for myself or am I doing this for others? Well, perhaps if we change the scope a little bit, you can understand how doing things for yourself and doing things to improve the system are kind of the same thing at a certain level of Zoom, maybe. So I paraphrase that, right? Like, as an observer of your sessions, that's a thread that I'm pulling out, and I am curious to hear from all of you how wrong I am in that. And I'd like to go to Tara first so that she can tell me that I'm a stupid fish.
I don't think that you are wrong, because I think there was something that I left out of my my presentation. Was I had a sort of graph, not map, because I've been listening to lots of Simon's talks about how, like, people that do good and people that do bad, and yet like charities that want to do good, or corporates that want to do good, and corporates that are bad. And there's a me in all of those areas, and there's a we in all of those areas, and there's no black and white there. There's a level of everything, and every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So sometimes when the intent is to do something good, there can be negative consequences. I found that a lot in my career as well. So Guy is in the audience, and I'm going to say something that he's going to laugh at, but you're not wrong, which is something, but also there's no right answer. It's sort of everything is intersecting, and I will draw that diagram.
Sue, do you have any sage wisdom for us on this topic?
Well, I don't know if it's sage, but I have some connections at least make. When I was trying to get ready for my talk, I did this like massive Kumu map, and I used as the frame Marshall Ganz's public narrative frame, which is the story of self, the story of us, the story of now, and just tried to like brain dump, just spew in a Kumu map. And so for me, it's always the dovetail of those things. There's things that are really important to me for whatever reason. I can't even explain. Why am I interested in improving human rights in prisons? I've never been in prison, never had a family member in prison, but fixated on it. Like, it just feels so unjust. It pisses me off, frankly, that we would waste so much human potential and deny people an opportunity to become themselves. So I do have a lot of passion around the me, we. I guess I balk a little bit about moving from me to we, because I think, as Tara pointed out, there's the you need to bring me, because the me is the thing that gets angry about injustice. The other thing that you said, Tara, about unintended consequences, that it didn't make it into my talk, but I've become a Quaker in my adult life. It's part of, like, I love the brand, right? The peace brand, and I love sitting in silence. But the Quakers were the creators, I mean, at least in part, contributors to the modern penitentiary. Talk about best intentions leading to things you do not want. I think this is why we need these performance systems to measure, because we will create things that we don't want. If you just want to end chronic homelessness in DC, you could ship them all out, the homeless people. You know, like, you still need to keep making sure that you're adhering to your humane mission and not just achieving the mission.
Achieving.
Mel? Yeah,
May I request 2 minutes for an indulgence? I have a speech. Okay.
of course.
There is a way to transform me versus we into both. What you have to do is to back up one level and to see that me and we are two different levels of description for a single phenomenon. And I'd like to do it through analogy. If you 2 centuries ago, if you went to your doctor with chills and fever and shakes, this was like in 1800, he would say, well, you probably have the vapors, and what I can do for you is bleed you, okay? And about a half century later, the germ theory of disease started entering the practice of medicine. And people realized that were things going on at 2 different levels of description. There's the presentation, which the patient brings, and then there's the underlying process, which is what's going on inside the body. Okay, so you need 2 different levels of description for that. So you're already talking about 2 different levels of language. And then enters biology, and you start tying the 2 things together. And biological research explains how things working together at the process level present new phenomena at the presentation level. So I've been writing about this for 2 years. I call it a model of emergence. And it involves 3 elements. You have 2 levels of description, and then a level of glue, which is a process that connects the 2. So there is a social model, and that's basically my research, which incorporates both me and we. And now the question is, and I can see there's a way to develop an understanding that does not put these 2 in opposition, but understands the 2 as part of a single process. Now the question is, what do you do with it? I'm ready to talk to people about it, but again, as Tara points out, you need people who are willing to sit down, who don't speak each other's language. And by the way, I want to inject, I saw a note from Matthias Ferre, who I know from domain-driven design. They have a model for doing this. It's what Eric Evans described as developing a ubiquitous language. We need to have a process for getting people together, the me and the we people, to develop a ubiquitous language so they can talk about this using a single language. End of speech.
It was a beautiful speech. And since you're taking a second to plug Eric Evans, I will say that for me personally, when I think about that I am a me and I exist in a we, right? I found the work of Judith Butler, who just completely destroys whatever ideas you have of yourself, of your I, of your me, right? Because it's nearly impossible to define yourself without the we, right? And it's actually really hard to draw the line of what is me and what is we. So very interesting there. And then lots of folks who have been around the mapping community over the past couple of years will be tired of hearing people plug Carol Gilligan, but sorry, folks, we have to plug Carol Gilligan again in her work, which is about the underlying ethics that we have, right? And do we believe that people are the things that happen to them, or do we believe that we care for collectives? Okay, so I guess now we can talk about the second part of Simon's question, I think, maybe. So basically the second part of his question is, what are we going to do about this, right? We have a lot of people and organizations who seem to be acting in self-interest or to get power, and we could have a whole separate discussion about what kind of power that we're talking about, but there's not necessarily a huge perceivable desire to dig into the system and change it. Those of you who know me know that I would also argue at that point, but this isn't my panel, it's all of yours. So the question is, how do we change any of this? How do we get these actors, these players interested in changing the system? I don't know who wants to go first on this question.
I can suggest something. I think in terms of global warming, which is just the ultimate impossible problem. And the first, I would make a distinction between description and intervention. And the problem, one of the problems I see is that we have all kinds of people who are invested in description, like journalists, for example, and commentators. But the transition from description to intervention is blocked. And part of the reason is it takes a different skill set. And I think this accepting that to intervene, if you want a germ theory instead of just bleeding as a way of dealing with the problem, you've got to go inside and look inside, which means you have to think in terms of two levels of description at the same time. And so the answer to the question that I propose is create a model. In other words, create a team that is committed to doing this for one problem, and watch that team work the process of working together in order to develop a single language to solve that problem. And, maybe global warming is too big a problem, but pick something, find a team that's willing to commit to the process, and then do it in public.
I wish I knew an answer. My thoughts are, well, yeah, that'd be great if I knew the answer to that. And Mel, that was inspired some of my thinking. And I guess the thing that strikes me the most is the language, like the common language. And how do we get the people in the room who disagree with each other? Because that's like, if you look at the systems that you're talking about, like Facebook, I only see people that really agree with me. I only hire people that have similar perspectives and opinions to me. In most cases, you might say it's a diverse hire, but you still have the same like values, ethics. We're not going to get anything done unless we talk to the people that are opposing that. So how might we like make the we and the me include the others, the opposition, the people that challenge this type of thinking, the people that don't engage with this. And that's one of the big challenges. So can we use our kryptonite to make us stronger? I wish I had more of an answer, but that's how might we?
That's why I'm suggesting a model and not doing it on the world, but doing it on a model that is a team of people who are committed to the process. So yes, you don't deal with that issue initially. What you do is you create a demonstration that it can work. And then you figure out how to scale this model.
Wow. Where to even start? Because this is breaking my brain a little bit. I have this weird aversion to trying to get other people to do things. Maybe because I'm like stuck in my terrible twos. And if somebody tries to get me to do something, I'm like, then I don't, even if I wanted to do it, then I don't want to do it. So that's like, first off, like I try not to get people to do things. But Mel, you said something that really provoked, there's my attention. It just caught my attention. This transition from description to intervention is blocked. And so I think rather than focusing on getting people to see that this is critical and important, I think shifting the focus to what's blocking people. And I think that's hyper local. And so I, in terms of having people do this in public, I'm all for it. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Mike Haber and Ben Mosier and I try and map in public, but it was a hot, messy mess and just chaotic. But that's one of the reasons I really appreciate Ibrahim's book, because these are organizations that have bought into like, we're doing this in public. It really requires you to shift your thinking about accountability. You have to be willing to make mistakes and own up to them and be like, yeah, we blew it with that move. And here's what we're thinking of doing next. In terms of accountabilities too, I can't help thinking about, you know, Tara, what you said about getting the people you don't agree with in the room. I want to share this video of this talk with the Interfaith Action Board, but I also want to speak to some things that really bother me about the way our work happens, which is that correctional officers, Secretary of Corrections, wardens, it's really easy, and Republicans, it's really easy to make people the opponent that we need to beat. And I don't see any way forward with that frame. I don't think it's possible. And so I want to get correctional officers in the room and say, what do you need? I mean, the three reasons solitary confinement, primary reasons are used are punishment for wrongdoing, individual or a whole group, safety of an incarcerated person, they need to be isolated for their own safety, or safety of a correctional officer. It's a population management technique that says, if I just take you out of the picture, you terrify me. If I take you out of the picture, I will be able to do my job today. So partnering with those communities to figure out what tools might work better besides forcing someone into isolation, which we know is torture. Like it's creating people leaving the in a much worse state than when we got them. It's not rehabilitative in any way. So there's a whole lot of
the most interesting, well, the project that made me leave where I was that I worked with a group of sex workers in a specific country. I don't want to go into too much detail, or you might guess the organization, but a group of sex workers who wanted to try and improve the lives of their children. And they formed a small community organization. I worked with an organization that supported them. It was the best organization I have ever worked with the most incredible people that were driving change. And they wanted to continue the work that they were doing because that was paying for their kids to do stuff, but they didn't want their kids out on the street at nighttime because they needed to use their homes for their work. So I worked for an organization. The organization went through a bit of a struggle and we had to close that project. And I pitched to every single organization to try and fund that project. And all I got back was, could you pick something more palatable? Can we have somebody that's, and so that's the type of like opposition that really, it's the type of, it's not opposition, but it's the type of relationships that work and create change. But the structure and society that we're in and the type of impressions that people get from Facebook and campaigns, that it doesn't allow for that to happen. And I don't know how to change that. I feel like, Mel, your models would help us to figure out how to shift some of that.
I have a book to recommend. I have a colleague, his name is Gilbert Steil, S-T-E-I-L. He has written a book called The Collaboration Response. He has done this successfully as a consultant, in which in a 1, 2, or 3 day workshop, he will get all components of the organization in the room, and he has a process for getting them to arrive at a consensus. Incidentally, one of his cases was sponsored by the UN. He went to Bangladesh. I think the case may have been goiter and sodium salt diet. And some of the constituencies he had in the room were the sex workers and the truck drivers, for example, because that turns out to be a very important part of the process. So this is a book in which he describes how to do it in a couple of days on a limited problem. And so there's a model there that you can work with.
Cool. Thank you very much. And I think some people were posting that information in the chat if anyone wants it. I fully acknowledge that we did not get through all of your questions, but these folks are all easy to find. You can definitely approach them. I don't know if any of you are planning on popping into the Square window chat in the platform, but folks can ask questions there, or you can find them out on social media. Whatever the case may be, I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. I hope that you still found lots of value in the session. I treat the fact that there are so many questions as an indicator that lots of value was had. But at this time, I would love to have just maybe like a closing insight from each of the panelists, if possible. And I know I'm putting you on the spot, so whoever would like to go first can go for it.
I have mine at the ready.
Okay.
I'll go. I thought about my accountabilities in talking here, and there were many of them. It was in one of my early versions of my presentation. And one of those, of course, was to you all who show up, and to Interfaith Action, the people who've been doing this work for decades. I'm a newbie to human rights work, but also to myself for the hours and hours that I have put into nerding out on Wardley mapping. It's just nerdy entertainment unless I share it, which is why I agreed to do this. Like, it's not, I don't love speaking in public, but I think we're doing some of what we're talking about in terms of doing the messy thinking in public.
Okay, if my suggestion is do something in public, and the concrete thing would be form a group that will solve a problem.
And mine would be always try and think about how to communicate in a way that the other person will understand. And not to be the cleverest person in the room, right? It's okay to be a stupid fish if people understand you.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. Mel, does Ruth have any closing thoughts that she'd like to share with us? Is she still hiding?
I thought it was off in the corner. Oh.
I
such
can't
wonderful-
see you, but I feel you there.
Oh, she's there,
Thank
all right.
you.
Okay.
Oh, goodness.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here, and please pop into the Square window chat. I will be there, and I think next we have the Q&A with Simon and Chris, and then next on this track, so after that Q&A, is maps, ethics, and power. So power came up a lot in this session. All I'm saying is we got a theme going here. Okay, thank you everyone so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all the participants. Catch you later. Bye. All right, I think we're good.